everyone, and welcome back. Today, I am so excited to have a very special guest with us, Dean Jobson, who leads admissions at Harvard Law School. I know so many of you guys are trying to figure out how to stand out within your application while also not feeling like you are some perfect resume. At the end of the day, I think a lot of you all want to be able to tell your authentic story and tell it for who you are and including some of your flaws, but also want to understand how this process actually works. Dean Jobson, thank you so much for being here and helping us have this conversation.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all your listeners.
I would love to just jump in right into what is the heart of the Harvard application, which are the statement of purpose and the statement of perspective. I've talked to some applicants when they're looking at these like two different terminologies, and some of them really struggle to figure out how to make the statement of purpose and the statement of perspective feel distinct without
Mm.
repeating themselves. What advice would you give on differentiating these two essays while still telling a cohesive story?
Sure. So for your listeners who are earlier in the law school process, Harvard Law School requires two different essays for your application. We call them collectively the written statements. One is, as you say, the statement of purpose. The other is a statement of perspective. The statement of purpose asks basically, why do you want to go to law school? And how does going to law school align with your goals, ambitions, and vision for the future? And the statement of perspective asks you to share more about you and how your background, experiences, and or interests will contribute to your law school community and to the legal profession. So they're very, at the same time, they're kind of very, very broad prompts. You can write a whole range of things for them. And then on the other, we think of them as asking two pretty distinct questions. One is kind of where are you going in the statement of purpose? What's your direction? What are you thinking about for your future? And then the other is who are you? And what will you be like as a member of the community? What I think is challenging for applicants, and we've done two cycles with these two statements. We started them in the 2023-2024 cycle. So over the last 2 years, I do think there's some applicants who are like, well, but this really essential component of who I am informs both why I want to go to law school and informs how I'm going to engage in my law school community. I think that I wouldn't, certainly repetition sounds like a bad thing. Like, you, of course, no one wants to be repetitive within their essays, and I'd encourage you not to be. But I think there is oftentimes natural overlap in different themes or different qualities that are really okay. And in the last 2 years, I've seen applicants do really effectively, actually. So I will just give a total hypothetical example. This is not a real person or anything like that. Nor am I suggesting that this is like, the best option or something.
Yeah.
But like, let's say there's somebody who it comes from an immigrant family, and that experience really very much informs why they want to go to law school, because they want to serve immigrant families and communities in the future, and also really informs how they're going to engage in the law school community and who they are. I would encourage that applicant not to feel like, well, I've used this one thing for one essay, and so I can't even touch on it at all in the other essay because I'm concerned I'm going to be repetitive. I've seen so many applicants effectively touch on the same themes, sometimes even sort of the same experiences, and certainly the same aspects of who they are, maybe like their background or their identity in both of those essays, but with a really different lens. And the lenses with that statement, this is speaking in broad strokes, but basically with the statement of purpose, maybe a more forward-looking lens of where am I going? And with the statement of perspective, a perhaps more reflective lens of where am I now and where have I been?
Super
I hope
helpful.
that's helpful. There's
Yeah,
no
no,
one perfect way to do it,
yeah.
but the important thing is to be really authentic. One thing I would just the practical tip I've given to some applicants in the past, and hopefully it's helpful to your listeners. I think it can be helpful to, if you once you get at a stage where you've got like two pretty solid drafts, maybe just print them out and put them next to each other and kind of highlight areas where you think, okay, am I saying the same thing? And you might be surprised at the extent to which like you feel like you've been repetitive, but actually when you take a step back and look at it in like black and white on paper, maybe you haven't really been.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And so I guess what I'm hearing is that these two essays are getting at like the why law, but also how are you going to be a student in the classroom? And then I guess for applicants when they're trying to figure out like which part of myself do I tell for these essays, it could be helpful to think about if there are similar experiences or backgrounds that are really important to you to I guess what I'm hearing really is important of brainstorming, right? Like thinking about why certain experiences matter to you, because I guess one could matter to you for your why law school, but they also could have maybe shaped like the type of person you'll be in the classroom, and it's reflecting on or commenting on those different pieces that make those essays different. Would you say
Yeah.
that?
And so take the sort of hypothetical I was giving earlier. Perhaps you might touch on that same theme of being from an immigrant background, serving immigrant communities, but maybe in your statement of purpose, you talk about your experience doing volunteer work with immigrant communities and how that informs your passion for serving those types of communities in the future. And maybe you mention that you're from an immigrant household yourself, right? In the statement of perspective, perhaps you kind of dig a lot more into your own personal experience and your family's experience and what you've observed, right? So the themes are present in both, but the reader is getting to know something totally different about you in each one.
Oftentimes what we talk about on our platform is for applicants to kind of imagine themselves as the main character in a novel, and each part of the
Mm,
application is like a chapter of that novel. And I can see how like these themes, in a novel, except this one is like not fictitious, right? There's like a current running theme about your why law, and so it's okay if like you're seeing similarities within the different parts of your application.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give another example. I've seen this is a type of essay again, not a real person, but let's say there's somebody who's super interested in financial regulation. They're super passionate about it, really interested in it. I might see a statement of purpose that's all about an experience working at, insert investment bank here, or, this professional experience and how it informs their interest in regulatory work. Flip to the statement of perspective, you might read a whole essay about how this individual's parents or grandparents lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis. And more of a lens of like a consumer protection and making sure that consumers and families are protected through regulatory work. And so there, it actually can be really, this is why I say don't shy away from feeling like, oh, I've got to do something totally different. There's repetition in those two essays in terms of the person talking about their goals, but a completely different lens that informs those goals in each one.
Yeah, super helpful. I want to get into a nuance of the statement of purpose that
Hmm.
I don't think we've gotten into yet. I think you've given us like really two sharp examples of someone who's clearly thought about their journey to becoming a lawyer. But for someone who's looking at this statement of purpose and, they're asking themselves to look forward and really articulate their goals, what advice do you have for applicants who don't feel like their vision is fully formed yet, or it's something that they are still figuring out?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked this because I would estimate this is like 60% of incoming 1Ls at Harvard
Really?
Law School every year. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there can be all of these debates, and I'm sure, when you were in law school, you heard this too of like, it seems like everybody has it figured out and people are using these terms. I remember as a 1L, people were using terms like big law and clerkships, and I like I really didn't know what they were talking about. I feel sometimes as a student like, wow, everybody's really got things figured out. And truthfully, like there's a handful of people who do, for sure. Right there's
Mhm.
people who know. I mean, we have some of our incoming students who are super passionate about areas like animal law and food law, and it's really really inspiring to meet those incoming 1Ls. They're not that's not as common as sometimes
Okay.
it can feel when you're a law student. I would guess well more than half of our incoming 1L class is just like excited about law for a lot of different reasons. There could be a lot of different motivations for that. But in terms of goals being like, what specific job do I want to do? They don't really know. They're like an open book. And actually the faculty like it that way because then the faculty can like teach them and convince them that property law or whatever it is like should be their next passion. And sometimes that happens. When it comes to the statement of purpose, it's important to realize that we're not asking you to like sign on the dotted line of any particular type of job or career path. There are some people who definitely are in that space and ready to go. What's more common is that there's a particular motivating issue in the world or community that somebody wants to serve or intellectual endeavor that really sparks their fire. I read a really interesting statement of purpose recently about somebody who was just like so into the classics. They studied the classics and Latin in college, like super into it, and they wanted to, use law as a way to kind of continue studying the classics and issues of antiquity. I don't know what that person's going to do with their career. Probably become a professor, but who knows? But then, what I got from it is that like this person's super intellectual and like school's their jam. And that was, to me, that was like a very, very effective statement of purpose, even though it's totally different than the two other examples I gave you. I think that when it asks you your goals, ambitions, and vision for your future, I do think you can go as general as you want in terms of goals, ambitions, and vision for the future, so long as it's authentic. And gives the reader just like a little more to hold on to than I want to help people.
Mm-hmm.
Helping people is a worthy goal, but maybe say a little bit more, like how so? Like what are the skill sets? Like what experiences have informed who you want to help and how? But it's 1 to 2 pages double spaced. If you're feeling like, oh, I'm just not sure about this 2-pager, or I'm feeling like I'm staying in a really general space. Maybe a more effective approach might be to do like a really good, strong, hit it with a hammer, 1 page, double spaced, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just be really declarative. So what's a good example? You can talk about like the issue that's motivates you. So let's say that you're like, I'm deeply concerned about voting rights. I've seen firsthand from the campaign work I've done in the past that oftentimes there's a lot of misinformation, or maybe you've got a good anecdote about like going door to door or like doing phone banking or something like that. There's a lot of misinformation about there on voters. I see the law as really pivotal to making sure that we combat misinformation through legal structures and ensuring that we have fair elections in the future. And this is my motivation for going to law school. You haven't necessarily committed to a particular career path, but you've given the reader a sense of just like what motivates you, what excites you, a little touch of experiences that you've had that showcase that this interest is genuine. And you're in and out in maybe a page and a half. And that could be very effective too.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And I really want to uplift something that you said because I think it can be a super practical tip for people in that focusing on who you want to help and how you want to help them. Because again, like you said, I think a lot of people want to help everyone, right? Or like something because in our community, we help edit folks' personal statements, and a lot of times people want to help quote unquote marginalized communities, right? Like they use like very general terms.
Yep.
And so I think what I'm hearing from you is that it is okay not to have like, I want to be at the DA's office in this particular state solving this issue. You don't have to be at that level of extreme, but maybe try to demonstrate like some experience and that you thought about it a little bit above. Like, I know that lawyers help people and that's why I want to be a lawyer. Having a little bit more thought beyond that thought. I don't know. How would you respond to that?
I think that's exactly right. I'll flip it to a corporate context. Let's say somebody is super, super interested in corporate law and corporate structures, and they've like worked in a corporate setting before, but they don't really know anything. Like corporate law could be lots of different things, and but they're kind of just like jazzed about big private sector stuff. You can kind of just share that. Like, this is the type of experience I've had. I know that these types of like big high level deals really light my fire, and I've seen that oftentimes the attorneys in the room ask the most interesting questions, and I want to be one of those people who like asks really interesting questions and like keeps these exciting deals humming. I don't know. But I think you can just you can share like, this is the experience I've had. This is what excites me about law. And that's why I want to go to law school.
Well, I want to turn our attention to something that I think is on a lot of folks' mind, which is the impact of the SFFA decision and what it means to share your story in this new environment. So how do you see the statements of purpose and perspective providing space for applicants to share, aspects of their identity or background in a way that's still appropriate and still feels authentic?
I hope, and at least for the last 2 years, we've seen that a lot of applicants have really successfully been able to do that. And I hope also done that in a way that feels authentic to them. So either one of those statements, and oftentimes both, will elicit a reaction from somebody who's in that brainstorming phase you were talking about, whether they're, brainstorming by like writing things down on a Google Doc, or like I do, like have a little journal for the month where you write all of your little notes. That's kind of how I am. But when you're in that brainstorming phase, I think for a lot of people, they see each of those prompts and they're like, okay, there's this aspect of my identity or background or experience that I think could be germane and to one or both of these prompts. Not everybody will feel like that's the right call in the end. People from all sorts of different backgrounds and identities will be like, I'd really like to focus more on this leadership experience, right? Or this particular professional experience. And I think that's totally okay. Like it's up to you. So I'd encourage applicants not to feel like they have to share any aspect of their identity in these statements, but many do, and many do really, really effectively. And there's no really, really importantly, there's no limit on your ability to do so. SFFA limits what universities can do in their review of applications, but not at all what applicants can share or write or tell us about themselves. So I think that the statement of perspective is often the prompt that people look to and say, okay, well, this is a really good spot for me to talk about my identity because the prompt does explicitly call out background, experiences, and or interests. But I've also seen that for the statement of purpose, for so many people, an aspect of their identity really, really informs why they want to go to law school. And as we were just talking about, especially like communities they might want to serve. So either place is a really good spot for it.
That is really helpful. And I think that it will provide some relief to people to hear that the applicant, really don't have limits on how they can talk about their identity if they choose to in their application.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. If they choose to.
Right. And so I guess kind of like expanding on to that, because I think these statements, these essays are not the only place that a law school admissions officer like yourself can learn about the applicant. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit about how specifically Harvard Law School, because I think law schools do tend to do this differently, take a quote unquote holistic approach to reviewing applications.
Yeah. It's always developing. We try to do a more and a more effective job every year. So we've got some things we're thinking about for the future, but then probably it really starts with the materials you gather from the applicant. So how you present them, I think, to the reader is really, really important. So if you have a cover page that has the person's name and like their LSAT score, you are signaling to the reader, this is the most important component. Like this is where you should root the entirety of your application. If, by contrast, the LSAT score is shared with the reader as part of the CAS report, that's the Credential Assembly Service report that LSAC gives each applicant that gets transmitted with their application, if that's like part of the overall academic profile that someone is considering with test scores alongside transcripts and other materials, then you're signaling something a little bit different to the reader as well. So I've thought a lot about that in the last couple of years of just not just like what are you gathering from the applicant, but also how are you presenting it to the reader, what order it shows up in the reader. So that's been an interesting like thought experiment that we try to address every year. But probably the biggest thing we do that I think I'm really proud of and I've seen works really well is to have a multi-reader model. So we have a first reader that's totally randomized. So you just kind of get your set of first readers, like the randomizer gives everybody 25 or whatever number. You get your first set of reads. Your second set of reads is also randomized other than you don't get, the one that you first read. And then for that second reader, it goes first reader, second reader, second reader. One of their tasks is to evaluate the application, but also put it on its path to either interview consideration, what we call the interview pool, deny pool consideration if the second reader thinks, okay, this is not a case that's going to move forward, or to what we call our hold pool, which is like the second reader can't really decide or maybe needs more information or more input. And from there, first and second reads are done kind of independently. It could be like drinking your coffee at 7 a.m, doing it by yourself. You could be sitting in your office quietly at 2 p.m. and doing it by yourself. After the second read, everything's done in a group with either kind of a subset of the admissions committee or the full admissions committee, sitting, talking, working through the candidacy, talking about it. And I found that there's not a substitute for taking that really slow and like taking the time you need to discuss each application. Sometimes you don't need very much time at all, right? Like it's just so self-evident that this person's going to an interview. But sometimes you kind of really need to sit with an application and come back to it and talk about it as a group. So that's been very effective for us. And then I've also appreciated, we have a faculty review committee. So after somebody's interviewed, and we interview about 1,200 to 1,400 candidates per year and admit about 800 of those who are interviewed. You have to be interviewed in order to be admitted. All of those are read by our faculty, and our faculty readers have just really strong and compelling insights about the application. If I have found is really useful to hear from people who actually teach these students and spend a lot of time with them in the classroom in a way that an admissions officer won't, So that's been really useful as well. So a lot of voices in the room. I think that I'm a big believer in a lot of voices in the room. I know there's other admissions offices that have more of like a single decision maker model where you might have kind of some filtering by staff, but there's kind of one person who's maybe the dean or the director who really just sits and makes all the decisions by themselves. And I personally, I can't imagine that. I think there's so much more richness and I hope a more holistic approach that's brought to bear when you have a lot of different voices.
For sure. And I hope our listeners out there are feeling a lot more confident. And for one, in the fact that there's this rumor that people think that you have a certain GPA, you have a certain LSAT, straight trash bin, not being considered at all. Or now in this new realm of AI that we're not even gonna have real people reading the applications. And so I hope this gives folks a lot of confidence, at least when in the context of Harvard Law School, that there is not one kingmaker per se, and that a lot of different voices are being in the room to consider your story.
The use of AI, but I think AI and admissions, the conversation so often centers around the applicant themselves and writing essays with AI and things like that. The whole world of use of AI by admissions offices is really a developing area. For what it's worth, I don't know of any law school admissions offices that are using AI. And I don't really know of that many that use GPA and LSAT cutoffs as well. But law school admissions offices are just dealing with so far fewer applications than a major undergraduate institution. That might be, some of them are getting over 100,000 applications. The most we've ever gotten at HLS ever is just under 10,000. We've never even hit 5 digits. They're just in a very different space, but I've definitely gone to some conferences where they demo the use of AI to read applications, and it's kind of chilling.
Yeah.
All the admissions officers in the room, admissions officers, for what it's worth, don't really like it because they feel like they do provide value as humans reading applications.
Yeah, I figure if we have this conversation in a year, the conversation might look so much differently considering how fast AI is developing, as you know, in people's willingness. But as of right now, this application cycle, I think it's safe to say Harvard is not one of those Harvard Law School, that is not one of those indulging in that.
No. I want my team to all keep their jobs.
So
and you have to worry about AI. I mean, there's bias and issues with a human's head as well, but I don't know. I'm not sure AI and algorithms, at least different studies in the criminal justice space, I'm not sure how well it would map on to trying to put together an equitable and effective process.
Certainly, right? Because the systems and machines are built by people, and people have biases, and so there's a whole realm of issues that I think will have to be worked through, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I want to turn to optional essays, because though I don't think Harvard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you guys have optional essays aside from the agenda, no. But maybe when there was the diversity statement, was that considered an optional essay?
We actually called it an optional statement.
Oh, an optional.
It was the prompt was really similar to the diversity statement prompts for other schools, but we had always called it an optional statement. So yes, it was optional.
Okay, excellent. So other schools oftentimes do have other optional essays outside of a statement of perspective or personal statement. And so what I think is that sometimes applicants misunderstand how to use their optional essays to their benefit, and also maybe misunderstand the impact that it has on their application. And so I'm wondering if you could shed some light on how maybe applicants could broadly think about optional essays and how they're viewed in admissions.
Sure. Will you give me just a tiny soapbox moment at the beginning, though? This is Absolutely. My own personal feeling. I had always felt a little uncomfortable with having an optional essay where it's okay, everybody has to write a personal statement, but then there's this optional statement, and there's kind of this signaling that the only people who should be writing the optional statement are people from certain backgrounds, and it always felt like sort of giving one set of people an additional homework assignment. in the world when we had the optional essay, I do feel that it like caused a lot of confusion for people on kind of exactly these lines. Like, I'm from like, my faith background is really, really important to me. Is that okay to talk about, or is that going to be seen as like you're misusing the optional essay, right? And the answer for our spouse was like, no, no, like please feel, we'd love to have more information about you. You are the main character. Like we want to know more about the main character and the protagonist of this application. Like but I think sometimes people felt hesitant, right? Like, so I just mentioned faith. Should I talk about my faith background? Should I talk about how I grew up? Or like, are you really only looking for people to talk about certain types of identities, etc.? And so I was really glad to move over to just like 2 required essays, because I think it signaled, or I hope it signals that like everybody should be thinking about how their perspective will inform the classroom. Not just people from marginalized backgrounds, like not just women, not just people who are underrepresented in the law. All of you should be thinking about how your background and experiences are going to inform and shape how you engage in your law school community and the legal profession. And I also think it helped eliminate some of that guesswork about whether to share an optional essay. That said, especially post 2023, post SFFA, I know so many schools have essentially added optional essays or different prompts. Some schools that even have short answer questions. This is probably, this is so prevalent at the undergraduate level. It's just like all over the place at the undergraduate level, and schools are trying different prompts every year. And law schools, I would say it's not quite as experimental in the law school realm. Mostly it's kind of essay form. But there's still a lot of guesswork out there. I'd say I'm not sure this is going to be a satisfying answer, but the thing to do is like try to really understand for that individual school whether that essay is optional. Because it might be labeled an optional essay, but the school might infer that you're not as interested if you didn't write one of them. Or maybe the school kind of like tacitly expects everybody to write one of them. This is like what's inherently frustrating to me about having this system, is because I think sometimes it's not always clear or transparent to the actual applicant whether it's actually an optional essay or it's an expected essay, and kind of like how they're being used. In terms of using it to kind of like add dimension to your application, I think there's a lot of different ways to do that. You want to be responsive to the prompts. I actually get a lot of statements of perspective that are very clearly written to one of Stanford's optional essays, which I think is kind of funny, but it's quite clear to me because I've read so many over the years, and like I know what Stanford's prompts are, and I totally get it. Like, there's only so much time in the day. You might feel really, really proud of that essay and think, okay, it fits well enough to the HLS statement of perspective prompt, but it's not a great look. It kind of, especially when it's not actually that responsive, it looks like you're trying to shoehorn in a topic that's kind of just written for somebody else's question. So I would try to, if you're going to write these optional essays, I would really try your best to like open a fresh Word doc and kind of start from scratch and make it sound like an authentic response to that person's question. If you're not going to do that, I'm not sure I'd submit it at all.
Super helpful. So I first want to respond to your soapbox commentary because I appreciate that perspective. I actually hadn't thought about it that way, how the previous format, and I guess maybe the existing format for some schools still, is that like with the optional essay, that there's so much benefit for everyone thinking about the perspective that they're going to bring into the law school, both from like your perspective as an admissions officer, but from the student perspective. I would appreciate if all of my peers, thought about how they want to contribute to this community and this culture that already exists. And if all of us have done this research about what is existing and how people operate, what are the community norms, and when we're thinking about what we can bring to that table, maybe it means that we're more willing to show up that way in the classroom and peers who also think like that. And then also like from an applicant perspective, I think it could be helpful for you to think about like, oh no, they really want to know like how I'm going to contribute to the community if there's this norm that everyone is going to be thinking and answering that same question. So first, I want to thank you for sharing that perspective with me. And then to your other comments about the actual question itself, I guess the 2 things I pulled out were, one, to do your research on what the school wants, and I guess I'll pause and throw a question at you here. When you say like a school should try to, or an applicant should try to ascertain whether this essay is actually optional, would you suggest that they find that answer by emailing or going to an open house or talking to law students? Like, how should they find that answer to that question?
Oh, right. It's like a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
How are you gonna find it? I mean, I would try if you can to posit it to the someone who works in admissions directly. Certainly like a law fair, an open house, that's one way. Most schools are also offering virtual webinars. And I think it's a great question to submit in a webinar. And usually in a webinar, you can also like submit your question anonymously, which might make it feel a little more comfortable. You could ask an admissions officer, like, what do you assume about an applicant if they don't submit one of these optional essays? Like, what's your reaction if someone doesn't submit one of these optional essays? But I think it can be useful to hear from them directly because at least my team is like pretty honest and candid when we're on camera in a webinar or like speaking to somebody in like in a law fair setting or like an
Yeah.
info session setting in a way that Anahar, our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful coordinator who sits at our front desk and responds to all the emails. It's not that she's not candid. There's only so much to say in an email. And you'll probably be getting something that's kind of copied and pasted from the FAQs on their website. And there's
Hmm.
often just a little more nuance to it, right? So I tried to ask directly if you can. If you're in touch with students at that law school, that might be a way too. And it just see if you can ask them, have them ask around. Like, does everybody did everybody write one of the optional essays?
Yeah, that's
And see, I also think like Miriam, who is the Yale Law Admissions Dean and my counterpart on the Navigating Law School Admissions with Miriam and Kristi
yes.
podcast,
Go
like
listen to the podcast.
yes, she's super candid. And when we do info sessions together, she will tell the room, she'll be like, 90% of applicants write one of the optional essays. And so that sort of is an interesting factoid because even when her team in its first year wasn't signaling like, oh, we expect you to write one of these, like 90% of people did, which means that you probably don't want to lose out on that opportunity to share a little bit more about yourself.
Hmm. For
So
sure.
that's an interesting fact as well.
Yeah. And I want to touch on something else you said too about writing to the prompt because I think this is probably something that, as you mentioned, comes up often for students, but they don't really see it as an issue because they're like, well, like you said, I wrote a really great essay. I'm just going to submit it. I'm short on time. People are telling me to apply it early, like whatever the reason is. And so what I heard from you is like, maybe it is a little bit more important to make sure you're writing to the prompt, at least specifically for Harvard Law School.
Yeah. Well, and I remember that admissions officers are reading in bulk and are reading over the years, right? So I probably read in total, I probably read a good like 5,000 applications per year.
Wow.
Between all of the first reads and the second read, I don't first read 5,000. I think the most Mark on our team first read 2,000 last year, and he like hit the first read highest number for us. But I like, between the first reads, the second reads, the whole committees, I mean, we all read a good chunk of the application pool. So over time, it starts to be so crystal clear to you when an essay was like written for another prompt and we know what these other prompts are. So it's, sometimes they're really good essays or whatever, and sometimes they do work for the statement of perspective prompt or the statement of purpose prompt. And sometimes I might never even know, but a lot of times they don't.
Fair. Fair.
It could even be in the framing, right? Like sometimes you might write like a really, really great essay and the content of it all really works, but maybe the way you're framing it at the top could be just adjusted a bit to have the lead in work to make clear that you're responding to this prompt for this school.
And I think that goes back again to understanding the prompt because if you're reading these like super fast, you might think like, oh, like these things are asking me for the same thing, like identity, and like some of them are very nuanced. And again, like just understand. I guess really the point we haven't necessarily talked about is like taking your time with the application and
Mm,
understanding the application questions before you jump into on LSAC, like ready to hit submit on submitting like 10 applications in a day.
right. I'm definitely the type of person who gets to the point where it's just like, let me just upload these things and be done. Like I want to check things off my to-do list in my little journal I showed you earlier. And for the law school application process, I really had, this is a lot of years ago, but like I had to really try to push against that instinct and just like map it out for myself of like taking it a couple of days at a time, because it does get exhausting by the end and you want to just be done, right?
Exactly. I had a spreadsheet with all of the schools that I wanted to apply to and all of their application questions and all the requirements and essay prompts. And even when I thought I was like the most prepared as possible, mind you, like this was like in August. I'm like, oh, I have my system going. By September, October, when I was really answering all the questions, it still took me like an additional month to have all of the additional essays, like the scholarship essays, like everything truly written in its follow. And so, yeah, this is just to say, don't underestimate how long it might take to complete just even one single application.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about something I think I personally enjoy, but I know some other folks might not enjoy, which is the interview process. And so I'd love to hear from you, what qualities or skills are you hoping to see in an interview that might not be obvious on paper?
You know, when I saw this question from you, the first word that popped into my head was enthusiasm.
Mm.
And I don't know, maybe this sounds obvious, but you want to, not everybody has like, DCC cheerleader style enthusiasm. It doesn't have to present in that way, but in terms of how you engage in the conversation and the content you share, you really want to talk to somebody who it feels like they're excited to be there. Or it feels like they're excited to interview with Harvard Law School. They're excited to potentially go to Harvard Law School. They've given it some thought. They've done some research into the types of opportunities they might want to pursue when they're at HLS. Enthusiasm was really like the word that came to me. And also somebody who speaks with enthusiasm and positivity about the past professional experiences they've had thus far, maybe their undergraduate experience, things they've studied in the past, and speaks with care and thoughtfulness about challenges they've faced, obstacles they've overcome. But yeah, I don't know if that's obvious on paper, but that's like the word that really came to mind
Yeah, so
of what
I
we're
don't
hoping
know.
to get.
Yeah, I don't know if that's obvious, but I love that specific word because to me, what that says is that anyone has the ability to be enthusiastic, right? I think some people feel intimidated by interviews because they don't feel like they're like very charismatic or they're not like, like a DCC cheerleader, right? Like that's just not their
Yeah.
natural personality. But you can be enthusiastic in your own intonation and the way that you engage, how you respond, the examples that you give of the work. Like you can really show enthusiasm through any type of personality trait. And so I love that you use that word because it shows that like everyone has ability to use like to just really show up as themselves. And if you're truly enthusiastic about what you're interviewing for, I think it will come out.
Yeah. It also can come out in ways that are maybe a little subtle. Like, did you take the time to set up kind of an appropriate spot for a conversation, or are you like, and when I say an appropriate spot for a conversation, I've interviewed people who are sitting in their cars, but they took the time to like adjust the chair just so and like have their phone up in a spot. Like it doesn't have to be, a mahogany desk or something like that. But does it look like they took care for a couple of minutes ahead of the conversation to be like, let me test out my video and audio, and just kind of get myself in a good spot where I'm confident and comfortable and feel like I'm presenting myself well.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful note. And I think you also mentioned something earlier too about professionalism, right? And talking about all of your experiences in a positive light, even if they weren't necessarily a positive quote unquote positive experience, or at least like being respectful in the nuance that you give, which I think is something super important for applicants to hear, because I don't think it's the intention of anyone to bash a certain organization or to bash like a lawyer or a colleague that they've worked with. They're just trying to be authentic. But maybe what they don't understand is that to the listener who doesn't have the full context, it can be kind of seen as a little unprofessional. And so it's just a helpful note to just be very careful about your words, because this person is only getting like a 30-second minute rundown of your version of events.
I'll give an example. This was probably 2 years ago. I asked someone in an interview, I forget exactly how I phrased it, but something like, tell me about a time you faced a challenge in a group project, and I meant in an academic setting.
Mm-hmm.
And the person shared an anecdote, and kind of what I got from it was, the time I faced a challenge was I was in a group and everybody else was really, really bad. Like, boy, were they dopey, and like no one had work ethic. And I was the only one carrying everything. And it was one of those things I was like, that could actually all be true, right? Like that could totally be the case, except for kind of what I came away with it was like, wow, you're pretty down on your classmates, right? Like, really? Not a single one of them contributed any value. And I think that was a good example for me of a time where like there's a totally different way to share that exact same story
Hmm.
that is still authentic,
Right.
but showcases the challenge in a more like a light with a little more humility and a little less knee-jerk negativity to everybody else.
Exactly. And I'm sure the applicant thought that was a good example because they're like, oh, I'm a really hard worker. I pick up the slack. Like, and you didn't take those characteristics away because of how they described that situation, which I think goes to another point, which is just helpful to practice your interviews and also to practice examples that you want to give, because again, when you're like talking off the cuff, like you may slip up and forget that, like, to capture it in that professional tone.
Yeah, exactly. I think having a good anecdote for like every experience on your resume, that's the approach I take anyway. Going into, well, I guess I haven't done an interview in a really long time because I've had this job for a really long time. That's the advice I'd give is like for every experience on your resume, have like a good anecdote or story at the ready so you're not just drawing on the same ones. And yeah, and practice it, right? Like you can even with your phones now, like you can record yourself, listen to it back. It feels a little goofy, but like it can be good
Yeah.
to hear yourself talk.
Yeah, no, I think that's so smart. And I also got that advice for interviews to look at your resume or really your CV, even depending on what you submitted, basically anything that you submitted, and be prepared to have questions asked about anything. So if you were like me and you interned all through college, and so they want to ask you about your freshman year internship experience in the summer and like that one project you worked on, it could probably be helpful to go back to your emails, go back to your notes to see like, what was it that I did there? Why did I really like was there someone I like really cool that I got to work with? Like really refresh yourself, and so it's
Right.
not like the first time you don't have like a shock, like you look like you lied, but really it's just that you haven't like engaged with that experience before. But I think
Yeah.
this sorry.
I was like I was nodding along, yeah, because I feel like we've all been there where someone's like, "Tell me about your senior thesis." And you're like, "Oh, what did I write about?"
Yeah, you're like, did I really graduate with honors? Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue to my next question, though. Of we're encouraging people to really practice and prepare, but I do think that there's a balance, right? Like you don't want to be overly rehearsed, and so I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that, like how someone could strike that balance.
What I tend to do is I tend to have kind of like bullet points in my head for each of the anecdotes. So I and the bullet points are not necessarily whole written out sentences. It's like things I want to make sure I hit. And then I allow myself to be a little bit more off the cuff in the telling of the story, to avoid that exact same that feeling of feeling like over rehearsed yourself, which can make you internally feel inauthentic, and then also to avoid having it feel overly rehearsed to the listener. So that's what I do. Bullet points. Try to make it no more like 3 to 5 for every story.
That sounds good. On a practical note, how much weight, and this, don't expect you to answer this for other law schools, but how much weight does the interview carry relative to the rest of the file, or how are you guys considering it in conjunction with everything else that you read?
It can totally depend. It can totally depend. So many interviews, like the file suggests that the person's awesome and a great student and like a lovely community member and someone who's going to be a leader. And you meet them for 20 minutes on Zoom and you're like, yep, all of my impressions are confirmed. That's so many interviews. And so for there, it's like, I wouldn't say, oh, therefore the interview had no weight. It was more that the interview aligned with all of the rest of the impressions. And so it was an opportunity for us to get to know the individual a little bit better, start forming a relationship with the person. Sometimes our relationships as admissions officers with people who are 3Ls on our campus are really rooted in that interview experience, right? So I think applicants focus on, gosh, is the interview going to get me in or not? We're also focused on, am I developing a relationship with all of my incoming students? Right? Am I going to developing the beginnings of sometimes like a lifelong relationship with these folks? But that's so many interviews, right? So it's the weight it had was it kind of confirmed and affirmed the impressions left by reading the application in the first place. There are interviews where, look, if you got an interview, your application was relatively strong. And so an interview, it could be a chance for you to really show your stuff and shine. And to the extent there were kind of questions about your application or people weren't really sure about something, or the reader wanted to clarify certain aspects of your trajectory or your professional trajectory or kind of what you're interested in doing in the future, or whether you're interested in HLS at all, your interview is a chance to kind of respond to all of those potential concerns that somebody has. Every once in a while, somebody really tanks it with an interview. Like, you'd be amazed. Like, sometimes people really can tank it, and it's usually something like, trashing a professor, or sharing an anecdote like the one I shared, where it's like, in the end, it was everybody else's fault but mine, or not showcasing much interest in all HLS, or sometimes even being like kind of negative about HLS, right? So sometimes we ask people, what are the pros and cons you see of coming to Harvard for law school? And we do generally want you to share at least one thoughtful pro and one thoughtful con. But we've interviewed some people who just like, really, it's very evident they don't want to go there. And then it kind of feels like, well, why'd you take this interview, dude? We didn't have to have this 20-minute conversation. I could have gotten a coffee down the hall. So that's kind of a rare case. In those circumstances, though, the interview does carry a lot of weight. And it can make it a lot harder to decide to move forward on that candidate.
Yeah, that's helpful to know that a new information to me, and that there's not a one size fits all to that answer, and that it's really just dependent on your file. Which I guess is just to say that in any case, you should always strive to have the interview be great, so that regardless of how it's being viewed, that it's just an add-on to your application. Would you say that there are any questions that you wish more applicants would ask during their interview, or is there no expectation on that front?
I think we say in our interview invitation that there will be a short period for questions at the end. Usually it really is like one question. That's usually how I phrase it. What is like your top question you have for me, or one question you have for me? The only thing not to do is to like ask someone something that could be found on the internet. Like, how many clinics do you have? Or do you offer any courses in international law? Or even kind of like, what are the next steps in the application process? There's kind of things that's like, well, you've already been answered that. You could probably ask Alexa, and she'd probably have an answer for you, right? Factual questions like, how many clinics do you have, also don't lend themselves to really any much back and forth. So that's the one thing not to do. In terms of questions more people ask, I really enjoy when somebody asks like, just about the students and the student community. And if that's not where your questions lay, that's totally fine too. Like, we can focus on answering questions on academic opportunities or service opportunities. But somebody asked me once, like, what's it like to walk down the hall at Harvard Law School? And I loved answering that. I guess maybe it's that I love answering questions about our students and our student community in a way that's like really descriptive and natural. Like, what do students do during the lunch hour?
Yeah, I love that.
You can't really find it on the internet, and I think probably like what the admissions officer shares could be really indicative of the school community itself. Of course, if you were admitted and choosing between schools, you'd want to like visit for yourself and actually ask students and everything. But I think admissions officers really love their students and love to talk about them.
For sure. And it shows, I guess, that they really want to put themselves in the student's perspective, like their shoes. And really envisioning themselves on campus. Now, that is to say, echoing back to your point earlier that you guys interview hundreds, if not, I guess maybe you said 1,000 students?
Usually about 1,200 to 1,400.
Okay, 1,200 to 1,400. I say that to say that I encourage everyone not to ask those specific questions in the interview. It's like, wonder where this came from. So I wanted to change to our final section of this, which is really kind of thinking about all of these application pieces, right? And our internal theme at Lawyer of becoming the main character of your law school application. What makes a candidate's narrative feel cohesive across all parts of the application, the essays, resume, recommendations, and interview. And also want to add space for you to say that like it is even okay for it to not be cohesive as well.
Okay for it to not be cohesive in a like prescribed sense. I mean, sometimes an application is. So let me describe the type of application that kind of like feels really cohesive. I was talking earlier about being thoughtful about like how you present things to a reader and what order you present things to a reader. So we usually start with the resume as the pretty much the first thing. So let's say I see on the resume that during undergrad, this person was a peer mentor. They worked in the Writing Center and they also were part of a sustainability initiative and like maybe some divest activism. And then after they've been working in the Rocky Mountains on a like a water rights campaign, I'm seeing just on that resume like kind of some hints of environmental law, conservation interests, right? Maybe in their personal section, like hiking is one of the things they list as things they like. And then let's say I get to the essays, and sure enough, there's like a discussion in the statement of purpose about this water rights work that they've been doing and how that really aligns with their goals to work in environmental law in like a community-based setting, and how they've seen the impact of working with community-based organizations, etc. And then in their statement of perspective, they write about like the joys of being outdoors and the first time they went hiking with their family and how they want to like preserve public land for generations. It's like oftentimes you can see the resume and you're like, I bet this person's interested in this and this. And sure enough, like the things that they tell you and the things that they share totally all align. That's an example of something that feels really, really cohesive, but it only works if that's actually authentic, right? And interestingly, there's definitely been some interviews over the years. We're just talking about interviews. There's definitely been some interviews over the years where somebody had like a very cohesive application like that, like all wrapped up in a bow, super cohesive. And it kind of actually broke down in the interview when the interviewer asked them about that. And it turned out that like maybe, and I think it was probably well-meaning, but like maybe there are applicants out there who push a little too hard to try to like shape a narrative and put themselves in a particular box for the sake of cohesion in a way that sacrifices on the authenticity piece. So that's why I say it kind of only works if it's authentic. But there's so many other applications where, especially like the stuff people are involved in undergrad, folks get involved in all sorts of things, right? Like, just because you're in a dance troupe doesn't mean you want to do art law.
Right.
Maybe it does, but probably not. And I think what I would focus on is like having it feel like a real authentic person as opposed to a like cohesive marketing narrative.
I think that's excellent advice, and it also just shows that using like the dancing troupe in example, like if you are someone who is multifaceted and have other interests outside of the law, that there is space for you too, and that you know don't have to have this perfect route to becoming a lawyer. I hear a lot of this anxiety from STEM majors, or for people who thought they wanted to be like a doctor, and they're like, oh my gosh, I did all of these like STEM stuff, I did all of this like bio stuff in undergrad. How are they going to know that I truly want to be a lawyer? And I hope this gives them some comfort in that what you guys are really looking for is to see the authentic version of how you got to where you are now, which is your interest in law.
And maybe honestly, maybe you don't touch on the STEM stuff at all, right? Like maybe it's like an example I gave earlier with the person who's interested in immigrant rights, who's like, that comes from their personal background and also some volunteer work they've done in the past. Like it's okay to not like, if being a bio major has nothing to do with it, like you don't need to talk about that very much. I actually think the reader will be inherently impressed that you're a STEM major. Law schools are always looking for more STEM majors. The reader will probably make a whole lot of assumptions about like your analytical skills, and positive assumptions. I mean, like they're probably going to be like, wow, this person's like probably pretty hardcore and like not afraid of getting bad grades, because oftentimes every STEM major has some like midterm that's totally disastrous their first year of college, right? So I think it would be a good thing, but it's not just because something is like part of your life and trajectory doesn't mean that it has to be hit alongside everything else in your essays. Focus on the most salient parts that are responsive to the prompts in front of you.
That's helpful, because I do think there is probably pressure for people to feel like they need to answer this. Like I guess from the applicant's perspective, they're like, I seem like a huge red flag, and to you're saying, no, I just want you to answer the prompt, and I'll be able to determine your interest in law from that.
Yeah. You know, a faculty member, he's not on our faculty committee anymore, but he was on our faculty committee before. He was like, well, like, if they're applying to law school, I just assume they're interested in law. which is a little simplistic, but I thought that was kind of, I mean, there is something to that.
For sure, for sure. So I guess maybe on the other hand, if an applicant worries that their story isn't quote unquote unique enough, what would you say to reassure them?
No one's looking for unique.
Mm,
People are looking for, someone who's going to be a great match for the academic program, has the academic skill set to handle law school, going to work hard in the classroom, contribute positively to the classroom demeanor, contribute positively outside the classroom, kind of be a productive community member. And there's lots of ways to do that, by the way. Like for some people, it's student orgs or whatever. Some people, it's like running trivia night. Some people, it's doing a lot of work in their faith-based community in the area. There's a lot of ways to do that, to be a productive community member and be like nice and friendly. And that's what folks are looking for. Sometimes unique is, I think unique's like a little overrated because it's not, law school admissions is not a quest for unicorns.
I might, and in fact, if you see a loop of you saying that on repeat, don't be surprised. Maybe I'll put together a compilation of all of our guests. It seems to be I interviewed Dean last week, and we have some other folks coming up too, and I think that will be a common theme, but it's also a common anxiety that I hear all the time, especially from folks from marginalized backgrounds who feel like they have the same quote unquote story as everyone else. If we talked about someone maybe who's applying from an immigrant background or someone who's applying because of racial justice issues, a lot of people feel like, oh my gosh, everyone wants to help people in the same way that I want to help people and have the same background that I do, and I need to figure out how to put like a spin on my original story that is my life. And I can't wait to put a clip like of all of these people encouraging them, we are just looking for whatever your truth is, whatever your story is, regardless.
I mean, I will tell you, I cannot count the number of times I've read an essay about, and this is the broad strokes version of the essay, an essay about like helping your immigrant parents with their small business. And the applicant often is kind of the first person in their family to have really fluent English language skills. So they ended up helping their parents kind of like work through various business issues. And that gave them this interest in supporting small businesses and sometimes regulatory issues like that. I've read that essay so many times. Every single last one of them is fascinating. Like every single last one of them is unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
Each family is different. Each person is different.
Right.
The trajectory is sometimes really different. Where the applicant kind of like lands out of that experience is really different. So I wouldn't mind reading that essay all day long.
I love, yeah, I agree, and I really appreciate you saying that because again, like I think people kind of sometimes also exist in a bubbles, and that's like what plays to it as well. Like all of their friends maybe who are applying to law school, and maybe they come from similar backgrounds, and they feel like every single person is going to be submitting the same exact story, and people, when you're in what you're in, like you don't realize how unique
Yeah.
you are.
Yeah, that's fair.
That, right? Like, and you also maybe, again, that goes to the point of really having deep reflections about your why for law school. Like, don't feel like you're just trying to regurgitate, like, oh, I'm an immigrant, so I must say I would be an immigration lawyer or whatever. Like, if you are truly reflecting on the reasons why you want to go to law school, the story that you portray will not feel like it's just a copy and paste of everyone else because it's unique to you, even if there's similarities of the issues.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I'd love to end on just one more note of encouragement. If you could give advice or one piece of advice to this next generation of applicants, especially maybe those who've overcome significant obstacles, what would it be?
I think, I'm going to sound a little dramatic, but we're recording this on July 2nd, 2025. The rule of law in the United States is really kind of in question. I dare say we need well-trained, thoughtful lawyers more than ever right now. And so my first, before some advice, is just a thank you for considering law school. And even if this doesn't end up being the path you go down for whatever reason, thank you for considering this profession because it really is a calling. And it's not an easy road. It's not an easy road to apply to law school. It's not an easy road to go to law school. And it's not an easy road to be a lawyer. But it is a really, really rewarding profession. So thank you for considering it. And my piece of advice would be to really spend some time looking outside yourself and thinking about you're the main character, but in what ways can you be the main character who's in the service of others because the world really needs you. And it can be so overwhelming when you look at some of the challenges facing the world and you think like, how can I make a difference at all? And I really feel that, but focusing on kind of how where you can make an impact in small ways, but meaningful ways in what you're doing now and what you want to do in the future, to me is not only a great way to get yourself into law school and paint yourself as an effective candidate for law school, but also to really have the right mindset for a meaningful life and career.
I love that so much. Dean Jobson, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights, your anecdotes, your wisdoms, your soapbox moments with us, and most importantly, your candor. I know that this is going to be so helpful for everyone's listening and who's trying to figure out, how to own their story and to really step into this application process if those are applying this upcoming cycle with the best of luck and the most knowledge. So thank you so much.
You are very welcome, and thank you to everyone listening.
Amazing. All right. Well, we will just pause for a second to smile for our screen grab.
Okay, wait, let me.
Okay. Amazing.